things like that. So how many people in the room went to the Battle for Bitcoin talk yesterday? A couple people, yeah. So we're gonna have like a much lighter approach. It's more about just getting an open discussion going. It's not about which one is the better chain. That's not we're 2.5 years into the genesis of Ethereum Classic. Most people are probably familiar with the DAO fork and the community split that happened afterwards that led to the birth of Ethereum Classic. So we're 2.5 years into it. We don't really need to dwell on those details. Rather, I think it'd be better if we kind of talked about where both projects are with respect to one another, and yeah, just go from there. So with that, let's allow our panelists to introduce themselves. What your work is on either chain, and we'll start asking questions.
Hey guys, I'm Yaz. I'm the head of developer relations for the Ethereum Classic Cooperative. My job is mainly to do build prototypes, engineer new prototypes that we can market to potential developers in order to get them to adopt ETC as a technology.
I'm Anthony. I first got involved in ETC right at the hard fork when the split happened. I was volunteering for about 2 years, and as of last year, I joined the ETC cooperative. Yaz also works with me, and I'm the director of it, so I basically just manage the day-to-day. At ETC Co-op in general, what we do is we do a lot of the ecosystem level things. So there's a lot of different teams that work on ETC, and we kind of handle, make sure services are up, make sure websites are running, that type of thing.
I'm Hadas. I'm a software developer at Consensus. I work on building decentralized applications.
My name is Michael O'Rourke. I'm a software developer and co-founder of Pocket Network, and that's a protocol that incentivizes people to run full nodes with a simple API for developers to access. And we're big supporters of Ethereum and EVM-based chains, and I'm part of a couple of the ETH magician rings, so the Meta Cartel and the mobile ring, recently created mobile ring.
Hi, my name is Virag Moody. I co-founded Authio in late 2017. It's an Ethereum-based smart contract security firm. We mainly do auditing, some R&D, and then we also work on development on projects like POA, plasma implementations. Thanks.
All right, good stuff. So the questions are divided into 4 sections. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But the four sections are going to be basically an introduction, an ideology, security, parity, of both chains, and then development and future direction. So I'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end as well. So let's go ahead and get started with ideology. To anybody who wants to start jumping in, what was your reaction when you found out that the DAO fork was moving forward on the Ethereum chain?
I was very upset on Reddit.
I remember reading about it and just following what was going on. I almost was thinking at the time that is to be expected for such a new platform with such a radical difference in what previously was expected or was built, and just watching everything with open eyes. I think since then it's been interesting to see the improvements and changes in the ecosystem, but just watching everything with open eyes.
Yeah, and so I thought that basically my reaction to it was that we all agreed that these things are immutable, are unbreakable, they're unstoppable smart contracts, and this was what it was sold as. And I felt that breaking and violating those principles was just hugely antithetical to blockchain in general. I personally thought the DAO attacker was a criminal and should have been found, and actually probably could have been found, and brought to justice in meat space. But to me, mutating the chain was just unacceptable.
For me, there was a lot of confusion when it was happening because I was really new to the space, trying to figure out how all the technology works. But the idea of hard forking and returning people's money back just never added up, because I thought if Ethereum is a currency, if it had a value to it, then how do you magically give people back their money on a new market? For me, it just never added up, and I was it was like a time of confusion for me. And I was just trying to learn.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then you can.
So Michael's come up with this, similar to the panel yesterday. We got a poll as to the favorite chain. Yeah. So hit that up. I mean, we can just leave it up there, right? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, go to the link and then vote for your favorite chain, and we'll take a look at it at the end of the session. So.
Real quick, just to add on to what Yaz was saying, the communication is something that I still think is a problem with Ethereum today, and it was definitely not very well handled. That being said, I feel like with the eye towards proof of stake down the road, it kind of made sense as to why they did it in that sense. But I totally agree with you in terms of the transparency and the communication of how they handled it was could have been handled better.
No, I agree. I think it should have been handled better. Like, I agree with what you said. And even if they're going for stake, great. I just think when you run a blockchain, you sign up for like rule before you join it, right? And you can't break those rules. Otherwise, if you do, it's not really a blockchain anymore. It's like, I would want to call it like a database specific.
I think that you can allow you're trying to get something as radical as starting off from a centralized world, you're sometimes going to have to do things that will allow it to proceed. You can't can't give birth to something out of it itself.
No, I see your point. I agree with you. I think instead of maybe like doing the DAO fork, if they just started again from scratch, learning from your mistake, I thought that would have been a better approach, in my opinion.
Also, for proof of stake, I mean, the DAO attacker took about 3.6 million ETH, and there's about 100 million existing now, and potentially a good deal more by the time proof of stake is ready. So that's a small fraction. Even if the DAO attacker decided to behave absolutely maliciously, that's maybe 3 or so % of the total potential staking.
At the time, though, it was about 13%.
That is true.
Yeah, which is a really high amount.
Plus,
and
the promise, sorry to cut you off, but the promise of proof of stake delivery was a lot earlier.
Very true.
Well,
and a key part of proof of stake is the distribution of the coins and everything. And if one person has 13% at that time, that's obviously very problematic. And to what Yaz said as well, I think the social contract of Ethereum was very clearly defined at that moment. And that's why the split happened. And now we have 2 different blockchains with 2 different social contracts and 2 different beliefs. So, yeah, yeah.
Virag, did you have anything?
Yeah, so I think the split kind of set a dangerous precedent, specifically for the Ethereum blockchain, as it was the one that decided to fork into that. But since then, we've seen numerous hacks. I think Parity is probably the largest one. And I'm happy to see that there wasn't really much of a discussion about whether it should fork. And so it seems like, Ethereum Classic and Ethereum have sort of perhaps aligned some of their principles. And it's kind of, I don't know, unfortunate that they have 2 different communities. But
yeah, and still, 13% is a large number. But in general, in proof of stake cryptocurrencies, we see a good 70% of the total net value actually being staked. So, and on top of that, no, that's mostly it. So the other argument, the main argument back then was not about really proof of stake. It was the fact that this attacker can go and dump this money on exchanges. At least that's the one I heard the most. And the thing is, when you have potentially ill-gotten gains, pretty much no exchange is going to accept them. The DAO attacker to this day has been unable to liquidate the majority of their funds. But on the good side, the group that captured the other 70%, some of those guys, because we labeled them as the good guys, they went and dumped millions of ETC within a day or two on Poloniex and Kraken. And that was seen as kind of a good thing when they were dumping that what by the other standard for the DAO attacker was ill-gotten gains. And that's kind of the thing why I think this idea of sticking to the rules is so important, because if I had millions in the DAO, I would be totally for hard forking to get me my money back. And everything's very subjective, and really blockchain's an attempt to create some objectivity in this world so we can have some sound platforms to build interesting things.
But I think more than that, it's that people would have been really upset if they had lost their money and they lose the ability to liquidate anything. And in order for any cryptocurrency to become a thing, it needs to be trusted and widely adopted by everyone. If somebody loses their money, they're not going to trust in the system anymore. So you're coming from a standpoint that because the hard fork makes you lose trust in the system. But I think most people would lose trust in the system if they lose money, not because of the hard fork. So
it's not really about losing trust in the system. It's that the system can't trust in any of us because we're all human. And it's kind of, what was I going to say? I'll think of it again.
I think it could be compared to people who came into crypto peak end of 2017 and obviously have not had a good time since then. It makes me wonder what damage that might have done to the Ethereum community as a whole if a good chunk of the people who were extremely excited about it lost, a lot of their funds early on.
Oh, now I remember. We actually saw this with Parity, right? I mean, I love Parity Tech. They're a great group of people. They develop and contribute so much software to the Ethereum ecosystem in general. Parity even gives ETC a client, and it's quite good. But they lost a good, what was it, like $90 or $100 million worth of Ethereum in that multi-sig exploit, and that was one group that contributed substantially to the ecosystem and lost all their money and nobody cared. But if everybody loses $100, then everybody cares. And that's the kind of thing where this is still a very subjective thing, and it's kind of odd that this very simple one is not being reverted, and this more complex one was. I consider the parity bug a subset of the DAO attack in terms of complexity and what happened and the triviality. It's really trivial to solve.
It's good to hear those perspectives. About the subjectiveness of the losing that amount of money and what to do about it, and there's no mechanism in place behind it. But I think we kind of covered a lot of ground on ideology. So we'll move on to security, and we'll move on to the elephant in the room, which is what happened in early January with the 51% attacks, as they were called in the media on ETC, and what is the aftermath of that?
Yeah, so several reorg attacks happened. I think it was on the 7th of January. Essentially, the way a reorg works, for anybody who's not aware, is you send somebody some ETC, and then they wait a certain number of confirmations and think it's good. And in the meantime, you've been secretly mining a longer chain, and that's one of the rules of blockchain, is the longest chain with the most proof of work wins. And then you cash out your Bitcoin, or whatever you've traded it for, on the exchange, and then you broadcast the longer chain, and that transaction no longer exists on the blockchain. Because you've actually made another transaction where you've sent it to yourself. You've created an alternate reality. And so, in general, people thought that this was going to be a terrible thing. It's kind of, well, it's not a good thing. But they thought it was going to be absolutely catastrophic, and it wasn't, and everybody was very surprised. And I think a couple of the reasons are that same thing with Parity versus DAO. A couple exchanges lost money, not everybody lost money. And on top of that, reorg attacks happen only with the attacker's funds. They don't affect anybody else who's using the chain. Only the person who's receiving is affected. And the reason that attack happened, though, so easily and so quickly is a couple of reasons. One, obviously, ETC and all other GPU mined cryptocurrencies are minority hash rate compared to Ethereum, because Ethereum is the majority on GPUs. And the other thing is that exchanges were trusting 75 to 100 blocks worth of ETC mining, which if you have the hardware is about $1,500 to mine. It costs very little. And by the same token, they'll go and trust 2 Bitcoin transactions, which is about $80,000 to mine, or 60,000. I don't know what the Bitcoin price is at the moment. And they were treating these 2 things with the same level of security when they didn't have them. So what we've come from that is we've, and sorry for taking up too much time, but we've been informing exchanges that, 1, you need to increase your confirmations pretty much across the board, because you're, as far as it goes, they're trusting Bitcoin with way, way higher security than any other proof-of-work cryptocurrency out there. And number 2 is, you know, we have other mitigations that we're working on, like defensive mining, where we can get a group together that can, on demand, pull up some extra hash rate to defensively mine and make the minority chain longer, you know, without breaking any consensus rules, without checkpointing or that type of thing. And yeah, that's what happened and what we're doing about it.
To elaborate further on defensive mining, we are taking an initiative right now because we are the one that got attacked into 51%, but we're not going to be the only one. It's only going to be the beginning. We talked to a lot of miners. They think the attack on ETC was just a test before the attack might happen on Ethereum. And even Charlie Lee from LTC was really worried about the attack because LTC might be vulnerable. So with defensive mining, we are talking to very reputable people. We can't disclose any information yet because there's nothing to announce, but we're looking into mining as a service, as a defensive mining option, where not only for ETC, but Ethereum, LTC, BTC, anyone like who's on a proof-of-work network that might be potentially vulnerable to be, you know, part of a defensive mining initiative.
I think it's just a fascinating situation because you know, 51% attacks have always been this thing where it's like, you know, we're terrified of it, and it happened, and the market just kind of kept going, which was really interesting. It feels like it might lead to a consolidation of proof-of-work coins at some point, where all these smaller ones either put on some limits, some kind of limits of these hard caps, or they might die just because they could get attacked so easily, right? But it's just interesting to see how the price dropped for a day or 2 or something, right? And it just kind of rebounded right away.
So cryptos don't die from 51% attacks. We proved that empirically now.
And that's a good point because you know, the reason the 51% attack a chain is to have a monetary gain off of it, and so it didn't really seem since I guess some of the ETC were sent back to the exchanges, that it was more of a proof of concept. Would you all agree with that, or was there? What do you think the motive was behind that attack?
I would hazard a guess that it probably was a proof of concept or a test for more attacks. But on top of that, I think the returning the funds thing was very interesting because to me that means that somebody out there knows who did this, and that when people do these attacks, they're not completely anonymous and can be kind of found out. So it's evidently not so easy to rip off people in proof of work, even if you have majority hash rate, because like we've learned in every other part of cryptocurrency, it's not in a bubble. Everything exists in meat space. So I think that that alone becomes very interesting because you have clear proof of a forgery or a crime. So I don't think that proof of work is going anywhere. And even consolidation, I would say, yeah, there's probably going to be more consolidation in the market, but I don't think that it's consolidation to the degree where every single proof of work cryptocurrency has to die out. I think there's going to be a lot more complexity there. I think the interesting games are just going to get more fun.
All right, let's move on to Parity and talk about how the two chains function, against one another. And so the first question there is, where will the technology behind Ethereum and Ethereum Classic diverge, and has that already happened?
It hasn't happened too much. There's a couple opcodes from Constantinople that we're going to hard fork in But then after that, to maintain compatibility, we're just going to try and work with the Solidity team and Viper teams and get them to have their compilers target different versions of the EVM, because that's what most compilers do, so we might as well do it here too.
I think if when Ethereum goes through proof of stake, that's when they diverge from us, because ETC is gonna stay proof of work for the long term.
So both chains are still EVM bytecode compatible. Is that correct?
Yes. At the same time, we're like ETC development is focused more on security application. Not to say that Ethereum is not focused on security, but like it's one of their like the MVP that being offered on ETC, like with IOHK, doing formal verification to make sure that that you have certain assurance that any transaction you do can actually like go through and stuff.
Side chains, when Plasma becomes integrated in, it's gonna diverge then as well, right?
For sidechain, we actually really like the idea of sidechain. ETC Dev, which folded, they had a project called Orbita, which was a sidechain. Right now, I think with ETC Labs Core, the new development team, what they want to do is not create a new sidechain, but actually partner with existing sidechain solution in order to run it on ETC, because we believe sidechain would be the way that we can scale forward.
So yeah, on that, the heels of side chains and blockchains as infrastructure, Michael and then Virag as well, I'd like to hear from you guys because you have projects that are in that space. So how does that relate to ETC and what do you see happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I see kind of Ethereum spawned a whole slew of different forks of EVM-based smart contracting platforms. I mean, you have ETC, you've got Aeon, you've got OneChain, you've got Quantum, and all these kind of EVM-friendly blockchains. And in effect, it's almost like a form of scaling, where you're kind of seeing the sharding of these blockchains and people moving on to different specific use cases, right? And I think the big challenge for these other EVM-based chains that don't have the most of the developer mindshare is finding kind of like their niche as to why they're more useful, right? So finding veering off into something that's different from what Ethereum proper is doing. POA Network has done a good job of finding their niche as a proof of authority network for Ethereum. I think Aeon is moving in an interesting direction because they're implementing like a JVM. So kind of like if you're an Android developer, you can build a full stack application, which is kind of interesting. So finding these other chains, finding their own unique value proposition, if you will, right? Outside of the Ethereum major community, I think is interesting for us.
Sort of to echo the sentiment about developer share, the fact that all of these chains are sort of EVM-based compatible, what I think I was worried about when the DAO fork happened was that there would be this kind of fragmentation and like those that benefited from the network effects would survive and those that didn't just wouldn't. But the fact that they are compatible means that as research is done, specifically, mostly for, I guess, for Ethereum, but as research is done on these different chains, and whether that's Plasma, whether that's other layer 2 protocols, that information and that knowledge gets shared across all these different currencies, different blockchains, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, so it's interesting too to follow that. So yeah, full disclosure, and some of you might know, but I worked with the Ethereum Classic project in the very beginning for about 8 months or so. So I'm very intimately familiar with the project. That's where I met Anthony and Yaz. But I do recall that myself and others, we submitted EIP proposals because one of the bigger issues at that time was the replay attacks that were happening because that was not built into the DAO fork. So a number of us on both sides submitted proposals, and eventually one was accepted and implemented in both chains. So yeah, there's definitely been cross-pollination over the years, and I don't see like why that wouldn't. So moving on, one more question about Parity. What's on the roadmap for Ethereum Classic with respect to ETH 2.0 and proof of stake?
We're not doing proof of stake, or probably not any sort of sharding unless it could be proven that you can fully validate the entire history. But what we are doing is what I'm not doing, but another team, ETC Labs Core, that works on ETC is doing, is they're beefing everything up. They're tweaking the EVM. They're targeting it to be 3 to 4 times faster from what they're saying. They're going to implement a just-in-time compiler. They're making tools to make development on ETC easier. Obviously, you can use Ethereum tools now, and you'll be able to use our tools on any EVM-based blockchain. But I think these things are things that are still very much critically needed. Deploying smart contracts on almost any cryptocurrency is very, very hard and difficult and fraught with pits and valleys and just tons of issues. So yeah, I think that first and foremost, we need to build up some of these things a bit more. Obviously, on the Ethereum side, they've contributed tons to this too, so I don't want to take away from that. But yeah, I think that's where we want to focus. We just want this very solid core, and then we can build more things around it.
And I think we're also starting to see the proliferation of tools that are more agnostic to the blockchain, where the tool builders, whether it's a JavaScript SDK or a mobile like iOS or Android SDK, they're focused on the developer experience and actually making it really easy for these other blockchains to adapt to these tools, so that way the core developers can focus on what makes their blockchain special, as opposed to dealing with kind of these external, really important things, but aren't necessarily core to moving the blockchain itself forward.
I have a quick question. So the ETH 2.0 roadmap intends on moving away from EVM to EWASM. How is that going to affect Ethereum Classic? Is that...
I don't think ETC may or may not fork in EWASM at some point. So hopefully, if you can do it as a soft fork. But in general, I don't think it's going to affect us much. And I've told people on the Ethereum side, like, you're going to have a really hard time switching people from the EVM to EWASM. Their build chains, they're using them. They're very used to these ways of operating, and they've even come to understand how the EVM works on a very low level because they have to, because they can't completely trust that the code they've written is correct. And so when you move to EWASM, you kind of throw out a lot of that work, and I think you're going to have a lot of trouble actually moving everybody to EWASM. For Ethereum's own sake, they should, if they're going to add EWASM, they should keep both EWASM and EVM.
Well, because, I think that's kind of the case. I mean, with the EWASM implementations that are out there now, the only one I've actually looked at is the one that Parity is doing, but it's it's syntactically the same structure and even the same calls in it. So I think there'll be more of a transition period and less of a hard switch over. Does anybody else have any comments on that?
I think if you look at Ethereum more like a technology with several different networks like Classic, Main, and the new 2.0, anything that outside of proof of stake we're open to collaborate on, because there's a lot of collaboration back and forth between the Ethereum Foundation and the cooperative on multiple projects. So as long as it's a not proof of stake related technology, even if it's on 2.0, it's open for discussion. We're open to collaborating.
Good. All right, so let's move on to the final set of questions about development future. So one question I was really curious about, because I only saw this in social media and didn't really get a chance to talk about it, but what happened to ETC dev team? And I guess as a follow-up with that, who is leading the development front for Ethereum Classic?
Yeah, so essentially what happened with ETC Dev was they ran out of money. My own personal opinion on it is that from the things that I heard is that the lead architect of ETC Dev kind of just completely mismanaged funds. And that was unfortunate, and there was some issues that arose with it. But out of that, a good 90% or so of the developers went over to ETC Labs Core. There's some more drama there that I welcome everybody to go read into, but it's way too long to cover now. And so development there is still continuing, hasn't really stopped, and they've hired other people since. And also, Tron got one of our developers, so good for them.
The question about who's now leading the new development initiative with ETC, I would say ETC Labs Core currently, with backup from IOHK, because IOHK does a lot of the research on like ETC and EVM in general. So yeah, ETC Labs Core, the new development team. The cooperative, what we do is more developer relations and development on ecosystem level stuff.
Cool. So this one kind of came up a little bit last night, and it's been kind of an ongoing issue. Truffle Remix, I'm not certain, but those tools can be used to develop for Ethereum Classic. You're dealing with the same ecosystem. But so what's going on with MetaMask with support for Ethereum Classic? What's happening there?
We wrote a PR, and it took about 6 months, and we got it merged. But then we found that Infura doesn't support chain ID, which is a particular attribute that you need to support in order to do support multiple chains. So then it got unmerged, and we're waiting for Infura to support chain ID because that's what's holding it up. But beyond that, we do have MetaMask forks ourselves, but we would ideally like to be a mainline because it eases everybody else's. It makes it a lot easier for everybody else.
I think that's just one of the small frustrations of having two separate communities that are doing really similar things. It would be really easy to integrate in chain ID, and if they haven't done it, then it's just because they're busy and it takes so much time to already implement things for Ethereum. Thinking about a whole nother chain takes a lot, and that's not what their main focus is right now. So, not
to take away from that, but I got to note that like Trust Wallet, for example, supports Ethereum Classic, and there's several other dApp browsers that do.
Yeah, I mean,
those are.
Sorry. Yeah, Nifty Wallet, Portis would be probably more than happy to support it. I mean, we're starting to see more tools that are agnostic. I mean, if you've ever tried to use an EOS or Tron app, you have to also download another extension, right? And as more of these smart contract platforms come out, it kind of makes sense to kind of consolidate them into tools that make it a lot easier for people to browse within chains.
Yeah, but also Infura is in a transition period always. I mean, it's hosted on AWS, and that is going to be transitioned out. So it's sort of a prototype almost right now, I would say.
So I guess so we're kind of coming up on time, or we're getting close to it. We want to do some audience questions. Let's hear some final thoughts on one chain versus another, or just how they both operate with one another.
I think in general, like the general social relationship between the chains is better than it ever has been. At the start, it was kind of like a really messy, warring tribal thing, and I think we've really gotten past that. Like, I was out drinking with most of these guys last night, so yeah, I'm more about ETC and ETH and less about ETC versus ETH, because one of my core beliefs is that I can't convince anybody of my ideology or beliefs if they don't like me first, if we're not friends. And there's plenty of good people on Ethereum.
Yeah, I think that I love that there are both chains. I think the more chains, the better. I think the more tools that are chain agnostic, the better. And
yeah, I kind of think about Chris DeRosa's talk yesterday about how he was talking about people actually meeting in person. And as he was talking about it, it made me think about how the Ethereum community in general is really good at this, where these conferences and these hackathons, these global hackathons, are now becoming almost like governance gatherings where people kind of ad hoc create these rings and start to talk about the development of whatever particular vertical they're interested in, right? So seeing more people at the Ethereum conferences who are more into ETC, for example, hearing their voices heard, I think is going to be really important in moving it forward in a collaborative way too.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate earlier what I said. Yeah, the way I see both chains working is just like if you look at it as a network with multiple different chains, and each chain may be supported by one organization and the other, there's a lot of collaboration on technology. And because first and foremost, I think about it as a developer, like what kind of cool tools can I use to develop the next app? And Ethereum does produce a lot of cool tools that we want to use. At the same time, ETC does have a lot of nice tools that we have supported Ethereum with it. Like, for example, Mantis Client by IOHK. It's like a Scala client. Ethereum Foundation loves it. They kept talking to Charles Hoskinson, asking him to support it and stuff, and now it supports Ethereum. It's like an ETC client that supports Ethereum. So I think there's a lot of collaboration on the technology front. Where they do diverge is your economic policy and the social layer.
So in terms of the lifeline of like where we are with blockchain and the projected sort of public adoption, it's still really early on, and each individual blockchain is working on security, working on what are their sort of core philosophies, tooling, things like that. And once we see those types of factors start to stabilize, the next step becomes interoperability. Obviously, interoperability is being worked on today, but it becomes a lot more effective when things are stable. So whether it's ETC, whether it's EOS, whether it's Ethereum, eventually I imagine that all of these chains will be able to interact to some degree, as long as security is sort of the first problem that needs to be solved. So in terms of like one or the other, I don't think it is a matter of one or the other. It's just a matter of where do you want to develop, what core philosophies are you looking for? Are you okay with centralization? Okay, then just go with POA. Do you want a more conservative approach? Okay, go with Ethereum Classic. Do you want to see? Do you want to work in a place that has the largest network effects? Okay, then work with Ethereum. So,
I think that's an excellent point. You mentioned EOS, and I found it pretty fantastic that Bancor ported their stack over and started supporting that. So I think that the dApp developers are going to kind of drive that, which is it's good, because that means that you're using that ecosystem to its full potential. So with that, we're going to open it up to audience questions. What's that? Oh. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
How many times has a Ethereum Classic forked?
We've had 2 hard forks, I think. We had one to disable a difficulty bomb, and we had one to implement a known monetary supply. And there may be another one that there may be another one for opcodes.
Okay. So my question, like, you're talking about the immutability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the DAO hard fork, right? Or the DAO hack. How is that different than hard forking? I mean, that's not a trivial thing.
Well,
I think that was a big mistake. And it has monetary effects, obviously. So.
Yeah, I don't think the monetary policy was a trivial mistake. It was something that was sorely missing, because having a no monetary supply kind of solidifies it in stone, which is kind of the route we're going for. And such a hard fork doesn't violate immutability in my mind, because when we talk about immutability, we're talking about immutability of state. We're talking about probabilistic immutability of transactions over time over a proof of work network. And that's what we want when we say immutability. Obviously we want to keep hard forks to an absolute minimum, but it seemed that we needed a some sort of solidified monetary policy before this thing got too large, and then there were people deciding on what it is in their best interest.
Okay. Just one more point, though. Having the constant issuance model, that's what Grin is doing. So it's not a no monetary. You changed a monetary.
It really wasn't, though. It was a change, absolutely, because previous to that, it was permanent issuance. You're correct. But there's fairly good precedent in the cryptocurrency space for having a reduced issuance curve, and the GRIN thing is very, very experimental. So we were trying to follow the Bitcoin model at the time. Obviously, it wasn't the best situation, but I think collectively it was fine because there was no contentious hard fork to oppose it, or there was no contentious no fork to oppose it. So yeah, I agree. It wasn't the best situation. Yeah, and hopefully it gets harder and harder to make these types of changes over time.
I just want to add on to that. It's not really breaking immutability if you're actually adding a monetary policy. Because, I mean, forget about the blockchain for a second. If you look at it as a database, databases go through a lot of network upgrades or a lot of new versions and stuff. It doesn't break immutability because you're not modifying the records inside your database. When you modify the records inside your database, you're actually breaking immutability of your records in your database.
All right, let's get some more questions.
So Anthony, your comment about having drinks with your mirror image in your in Ethereum and saying that we're friends now and we want to share information.
Some of us are friends.
Yeah.
Some people don't like me on the
that's the
Ethereum
same thing
side.
with me. I met with all the BTC guys yesterday, and I feel like they're my brothers and sisters. We have more in common. We have more difference, and I'm trying to figure out how can we solve this tribalism problem. And I think this is maybe this is a crazy idea, but my take is that the holding of the currency is what creates the adversarial environment, because if one wins and one you loses and you're on the wrong chain, then I can't feed my kids or whatever. So what if we make it a social norm in crypto to where you do not hold the currency? The only way that you earn money is by building an application or a business on the blockchain and earning revenue. And with that, your focus is on your customer, and you use whatever blockchain helps you achieve that end. Because I've been working with the BSV community, and I'm thinking about what went wrong with the BTC community, and I think it's a crazy idea, but it makes sense to me. It's like, what if we tell people we discourage people from buying the currencies that owning the currency, and the only way that you can earn money is by building a business.
What we're trying to talk about here. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing the panel.
I could answer my idea on this.
Go ahead.
I agree with that. Personally, that's the practice that I practice. That I don't hold anything because it's too much of a conflict of interest with what I do every day, which is build decentralized applications. And so I totally agree with that on a personal level. But I also think that a lot of the investors are people who are building, and you wouldn't want I don't want the prices of all the coins to go down because we tell people not to hold.
So I acknowledge that, and it seems that's why you're a very reasonable person. But my thing is that the incentive should be to earn revenue by providing a service to your customer, as opposed to making money by speculating on the coin. It's like saying, "Oh, I'm going to buy yuan, and I'm going to hold it." Because I think that the economy, it is Forex. people do that. But the main economic activity is that I'm going to build in the U.S. and earn U.S. dollars because I want to start a business, or I'm going to start a business in China and earn yuan.
I think putting strong ideologies on, trying to have a lot of people adopt one ideology is always not going to work. Everybody has different incentives.
I think we should build on that. But no, let's get back
to answer the question though on how do I kind of do this to try and get communities together and not be so divisive. First, you have to realize where you are, what your position is in the field. Obviously, ETC is a smaller blockchain than ETH. And then when you do that, if you're on that smaller blockchain, that minority chain, you have to be the one who reaches out and tries to do these things. Virgil on the Ethereum side, to his credit, he was the first person to invite me to EdCon, so that's where this really all started. But the other thing you have to do when you're on the minority chain, or you have an ideology that not everybody's accepting, is you have to be more tolerant. So Anytime you go into a new community, one of the first things people are going to do is they're going to pick at you because they have an idea or image of you that's not the same as reality. And so just long term, if you want to connect more communities and you want to build up blockchain bigger, and you're on the minority side, you have to be nicer. And if you're on the majority side, you have to be more accepting, more open-minded, and realize that being exposed to other ideologies and other ideas is actually very good for you. And it keeps you from ending up with very tunnel vision. So, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That would definitely affect anybody. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna grab another question, but no, thank you all for that. That was very insightful.
This is to the ETC supporters. If the DAO issue wasn't with the smart contract, but was with Geth itself, would you still support ETC? Like if Geth messed up their implementation of the Ethereum protocol?
In that case, if it's an implementation issue and it clearly violates what was agreed upon in that situation, I'd probably support doing the same thing Bitcoin did a while ago, which is you have a major catastrophic bug and you go and you mine the minority chain, and everybody kind of agrees to go mine the minority chain that got forked off in that critical issue, and then that quickly becomes the majority chain.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So you mentioned on the topic of 51% attacks, how there's kind of a security model where you want the amount that is rewarded in a period of time that you're waiting for confirmation to be worth more than the amount that you're actually sending to disincentivize some pay miners. Execute a 51% attack. With something like Bitcoin, where say someone's trying to buy a house for $1 million, they may feel comfortable after 6, 10, 20 blocks, whatever. On some of these minority chains, that would be kind of a usability problem if you're trying to do large volumes and you feel like you have to wait a very long time to avoid those. How do you think some of these minority chains can overcome the usability problem?
Yes, so there's obviously much more friction. I tell people all the time, Bitcoin is the fastest way to trustlessly send people money on the internet because it has that level of security. Over time, as value accrues, obviously it becomes worth more and then it gains more security indirectly from that. But the other thing is, for exchanges, for example, which is the main case for double spends right now, they don't need to stop deposits, they don't need to stop trading, they just need to wait longer to allow withdrawals. And so that's kind of the thing where, yeah, the security, you have to wait a bit longer, but I would hazard a guess that it's not terrible to have somebody wait 12 hours or 24 hours to withdraw their money after trading to ensure that the funds are more secure, because we do that everywhere else and it's not a major usability issue. If you want to buy Bitcoin with fiat, you have to send the fiat, and those bank transfers take several days too. And that's on the purchasing, but trading is like pretty much immediate for most of them, and they've solved that issue because they've had that issue. And on cryptocurrency exchanges, I think, haven't thought that they have that issue and need to think about it, and they'll probably solve it in exactly the same way.
So I kind of disagree, actually. I think one of the biggest value propositions of working with cryptocurrencies is that sort of like instantaneous transaction. But specifically to answer your question, I think that was the point that I was trying to get at before about various projects having sort of different value propositions across the board, right? So it's been a while since I read up on Nano, but I'm pretty sure the issue that you're having about like waiting for block confirmations you don't have that issue with Nano because you mine, I think you mine the block on your own device. So, I mean, perhaps the solution to that is, depending on what you're trying to do and for what reason you're trying to transact, you have different, different projects that facilitate that. And then as the space matures and stabilizes, hopefully that becomes a lot easier due to interoperability.
How many people here played Pokemon Go when it first came out? Anyone? It was incredibly slow and impossible to use, but we still played it. And that was because it found some kind of product market fit, right? And if I'm willing to use ETC for some very specific reason that Ethereum can't handle, I'm probably willing to wait for these longer times, even if it's a minority chain. So yeah, just to what he was saying, needs to find some value proposition that's powerful enough for me to be able to sit through it.
I also think there should be a correlation with the value that you're transferring. So if you're transferring $1 million, you can afford to wait a day. You don't have to get it immediately. But if you're sending like $5, you can shorten the time that you're waiting.
All right. So that's it for our time and our questions. It looks like overwhelmingly ETC is beat out Ethereum. People made up their minds for the most part. I don't know what that means. No, but by show of hands, like how many people like and support ETC and what they're trying to do versus Ethereum? If you're in that space. No, you're good. You're good. All right. So yeah, thank you, and thank our panelists.